Good morning and welcome back to my channel. I am your loyal Hufflepuff, and today we'll be going into more of our book, Goosebumps. I'm going to try to make this the last part of this three-part series. There is a TV show called Goosebumps that came out in the 90s, and there is an episode that is based off of this book, a two-part episode titled Stay Out of the Basement, which is the same title as the book here. This is currently the second book of the series. Although you can read these books in any order you choose, I'm just letting you know that this is the second book of the series. This is also written by R.L. Stine, who's made appearances on the series as well. So without further ado, let us hope to finish this book, and I'm hoping to hear you guys in the comments down below if you're enjoying this Halloween special of our book reading. Margaret uttered a shriek of terror and spun away from the plants to find her brother. "Help!" Casey cried. Gripped with fear, Margaret took a few steps toward Casey, then saw the small gray creature scampering across the floor. She started to laugh. "Casey, it's a squirrel!" "What?" His voice was several octaves higher than normal. It grabbed me. It grabbed my ankles, and look," Margaret said, pointing. "It's a squirrel. Look how scared it is. It must have run right into you." "Oh," Casey sighed. The color began to return to his ash-gray face. "I thought it was a plant." "Right. A furry gray plant," Margaret said, shaking her head. Her heart was still thudding in her chest. "You sure gave me a scare, Casey." The squirrel stopped several yards away, turned, stood on its hind legs, and stared back at them, quivering all over. "How did the squirrel get down here?" Casey demanded, his voice still shaky. Margaret shrugged. "Squirrels are always getting in," she said. "And remember that chipmunk that we couldn't get rid of?" Then she glanced over to the small ground-level window at the top of the opposite wall. "That window, it's open," she told Casey. "The squirrel must have climbed in over there." "Shoo!" Casey yelled at the squirrel. He started to chase it. The squirrel's tail shot right up in the air, and then it took off running through the tangled plants. Get out, Casey screamed. The terrified squirrel, with Casey in close pursuit, circled the plants twice. Then it headed to the far wall, leapt onto a carton, then onto a higher carton, then bounded out the open window. Casey stopped running and stared up at the window. "Good work," Margaret said. "Now let's get out of here. We don't know what anything is. We have no idea. We have no idea what to look for. So we can't tell if Dad is telling the truth or not." She started toward the stairs, but stopped when she heard the bumping sound. "Casey, did you hear that?" She searched for her brother, but he was hidden by the thick leaves of the plants. "Casey?" "Yeah, I heard it," he answered, still out of her view. "It's coming from the supply closet." The loud thumping made Margaret shudder. It sounded to her exactly like someone banging on the closet wall. "Casey, let's check it out," she said. No reply. The banging got louder. "Casey?" Why wasn't he answering her? "Casey, where are you? You're frightening me," Margaret called, moving closer to the shimmering plants. Another tomato plopped to the ground, so near her foot, it made her jump. Despite the intense heat, she suddenly felt cold all over. "Casey?" "Margaret, come here. I found something," he finally said. He sounded uncertain, worried. She hurried around the plants and saw him standing in front of the work table beside the supply closet. The banging from the closet had stopped. "Casey, what's the matter? You scared me," Margaret scolded. She stopped and leaned against the wooden work table. "Look," her brother said, holding up a dark folded folded up bundle. I found this on the floor, shoved under this work table. Huh? What is it? Margaret asked. Casey unfolded it. It was a suit jacket, a blue suit jacket. A red striped necktie was folded in, inside it. It's Mr. Martinez's, Casey said, squeezing the collar of the wrinkled jacket between his hands. It's his jacket and tie. Margaret's mouth dropped open into a wide O of surprise. You mean he left it here? If he left it, why was it bundled up and shoved back under the table? Casey asked. Margaret stared at the jacket. She ran her hand over the silky striped tie. Did you see Mr. Martinez leave the house yesterday afternoon? Casey asked. No, Margaret answered. But he must have left. I mean, his car was gone. He didn't drive, remember? He told Dad he got a lift. Margaret raised her eyes from the wrinkled jacket to her brother's worried face. Casey, what are you saying? That Mr. Martinez didn't leave? That he was eaten by a plant or something? That's ridiculous. Then why were his coat and tie hidden like that? Casey demanded. Margaret didn't have a chance to respond. They both gasped as they heard loud footsteps on the stairs. Someone was hurrying down the basement. Hide, Margaret whispered. Where? Casey asked, his eyes wide with panic. That's the end of chapter 14. Let's go ahead and continue reading on in chapter 15. Margaret leapt up onto the curtain, then pulled herself through the small open window. A tight squeeze, but she struggled out onto the grass. Then she turned around to help Casey. That squirrel turned out to be a friend, she thought, tugging her brother's arms as he scrambled out of the basement. It showed us the only escape route. The afternoon air felt quite cool compared to the steamy basement. Breathing hard, they both squatted down to peer into the window. Who is it? Casey whispered. Margaret didn't have to answer. They both saw their father step into the white light, his eyes searching the plant room. Why did Dad come back? Casey asked. Shh. Margaret held a finger to her lips. Then she climbed to her feet and pulled Casey toward the back door. Come on, hurry. The back door was unlocked. They stepped into the kitchen just as their father emerged from the basement, a concerned expression on his face. Hey, there you are, he exclaimed. Hi, Dad, Margaret said, trying to sound casual. Why'd you come back? Had to get more tools, he answered, studying their faces. He eyed them suspiciously. Where were you two? Out in the backyard, Margaret said quickly. We came in when we heard the back door slam. Dr. Brewer scowled and shook his head. You never used to lie to me before, he said. I know you went down into the basement again. You left the door wide open. We just wanted to look, Casey said quickly, glancing at Margaret, his expression fearful. We found Mr. Martinez's jacket and tie, Margaret said. What happened to him, Dad? Huh. The question seemed to catch Dr. Brewer by surprise. Why did he leave his jacket and tie down there? Margaret asked. I'm raising two snoops, her father griped. Martinez got hot, okay? I have to keep the basement at a very high tropical temperature with lots of humidity. Martinez became uncomfortable. He removed his jacket and tie and put them down on the work table. Then he forgot them when he left. Dr. Brewer chuckled. I think he was in a state of shock from everything I showed him down there. It's no wonder he forgot his things. But I called Martinez this morning. I'm going to drive over and return his stuff when I finish at Mr. Henry's. Margaret saw a smile break out of Casey's face. She felt relieved, too. It was good to know that Mr. Martinez was okay. How awful to suspect my own father of doing something terrible to someone, she thought. But she couldn't help herself. The fear returned every time she saw him. I better get going, Dr. Beer said, carrying the tools he had picked up. He started toward the back door, but he stopped at the end of the hall and turned around. Don't go back in the basement, okay? It really could be dangerous. You could be very sorry. Margaret listened to the screen door slam behind him. Was that a warning or a threat? She wondered. That's the end of chapter 15. Now we go to chapter 16. Margaret spent Saturday morning biking up the Golden Hills with Diane. The sun burned through the morning smog, and the skies turned blue. A strong breeze kept them from getting too hot. The narrow road was lined with red and yellow wildflowers, and Margaret felt as if she were traveling somewhere far, far away. They had lunch at Diane's house, tomato soup and avocado salad, then wandered back to Margaret's house, trying to figure out how to spread the rest of a beautiful afternoon. Dr. Brewer was just backing the station wagon down the drive as Margaret and Diane rode up on their bikes. He rolled down the window, a broad smile on his face. Good news, he shouted. Your mom is on her way home. I'm going to the airport to get her. Oh, that's great, Margaret exclaimed, so happy she could almost cry. Margaret and Diane waved and pedaled up the driveway. I'm so happy, Margaret thought. It'll be so good to have her back, someone I can talk to, someone who can explain about Dad. They looked through some old copies of Sassy and People in Margaret's room, listening to some tapes that Margaret had recently bought at a little past 3. Diane suddenly remembered that she had a makeup piano lesson that she was late for. She rushed out of the house in a panic, jumped on her bike, yelled, Say hi to your mom for me, and disappeared down the drive. Margaret stood behind the house looking out at the rolling hills, wondering what to do next to make the time pass before her mother got home. The strong, swirling breeze felt cool against her face. She decided to get a book and go sit down with it under the shady sassafras tree in the middle of the yard. She turned and pulled out the kitchen door, and Casey came running up. Where are our kites? He asked out of breath. Kites? I don't know. Why? Margaret asked. Hey! She grabbed his shoulder to get his attention. Mom's coming home. She should be here in an hour or so. Great, he cried. Just enough time to fly some kites. It's so windy. Come on. Want to fly 'em with me? Sure, Margaret said. It would help pass the time. She thought hard, trying to remember where they put the kites. Are they in the garage? No, Casey told her. I know. They're in the basement, on those shelves. The string, too. He pushed past her into the house. I'll jimmy the lock and go down and get them. Hey, Casey, be careful down there, she called after him. He disappeared into the hallway. Margaret had second thoughts. She didn't want Casey down there by himself in the plant room. Wait up, she called. I'll come with you. They made their way down the stairs quickly, into the hot, steamy air, into the bright lights. The plant seemed to bend toward them, to reach out to them as they walked by. Margaret tried to ignore them, walking right behind Casey. She kept her eyes on the tall metal shelves straight ahead. The shelves were deep and filled with old, unwanted toys, games, and sports equipment. A plastic tent, some old sleeping bags. Casey got there first and started rummaging around on the lower shelves. I know they're here somewhere, he said. Yeah, I remember storing them here, Margaret said, running her eyes over the top shelves. Casey, down on his knees, started pulling boxes off the bottom shelf. Suddenly he stopped. Whoa, Margaret! Huh? She took a step back. What is it? Look at this, Casey said softly. He pulled something out from behind the shelves, then stood up with it bundled in his hands. Margaret saw that he was holding a pair of black shoes and a pair of blue trousers. Blue suit trousers? His face suddenly pale. His features drawn. Casey let the shoes drop to the floor. He unfurled the trousers and held them up in front of him. Hey, look in the back pocket, Margaret said, pointing. Casey reached into the back pocket and pulled out a black leather wallet. I don't believe this, Margaret said. Casey's hands trembled as he opened the wallet and searched inside. He pulled out a green American Express card and read the name on it. It belongs to Mr. Martinez, he said, swallowing hard. He raised his eyes to Margaret's. This is Martinez's stuff. Mr. Martinez's stuff. Finished with chapter 16, continue with chapter 17. Dad lied, Casey said, staring in horror at the wallet in his hands. Mr. Martinez might leave without his jacket, but he wouldn't leave without his pants and shoes. But what happened to him? Margaret asked, feeling sick. Casey slammed the wallet shut. He shook his head sadly, but didn't reply. In the center of the room, a plant seemed to groan, the sound startling the two kids. Dad lied, Casey repeated, staring down at the plants and the shoes on the floor. Dad lied to us. What are we going to do? Margaret cried, panic and desperation in her voice. We've got to tell someone what's happening here. But who? The plant groaned again. Tendrils snaked along the dirt. Leaves clapped against each other softly, wetly. And then the banging began again in the supply closet next to the shelves. Margaret stared at Casey. Just thumping. What is it? That thumping. What is it? They both listened to the insistent banging sounds. A low moan issued from the closet, followed by a higher pitched one. Both mournful, both very human sounding. I think someone's in there, Margaret exclaimed. Maybe it's Mr. Martinez, Casey suggested, still gripping the wallet tightly in his hand. Thud, thud, thud. Do you think we should open the closet? Casey asked timidly. A plant groaned as if answering. Yes, I think we should, Margaret replied, suddenly cold all over. If it's Mr. Martinez in there, we've got to let him out. Casey set the wallet down on the shelf. Then they moved quickly to the supply closet. Across from them, the plant seemed to shift and move as the two kids did. They heard breathing sounds, another groan, scurrying noises. Leaves bristled on their stalks. Tendrils drooped and slid. Hey, look, Casey cried. I see, Margaret said. The closet door wasn't just locked by a 2x4. A 2x4 had been nailed over it. The thud, 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 thud. There's someone in there. I know it, Margaret cried. I'll get the hammer, Casey said, keeping close to the wall and as far away from the plants as he could. He edged his way toward the work table. A few seconds later, he returned with a claw hammer. Thud, thud. Working together, they pried the 2x4 off the door. It clattered noisily to the floor. The banging from inside the supply closet grew louder, more insistent. Now what do we do about the lock? Margaret asked, staring at it. Casey scratched his head. They both had perspiration dripping down their faces. The steamy hot air made it hard to catch their breaths. I don't know how to unlock it, Casey said, stumped. What if we tried to pry the door off the way we pulled off the 2x4? Margaret asked. Thud, thud, thud. Casey shrugged. I don't know. Let's try. Working the claw of the hammer into the narrow crack, they tried prying the door on the side of the lock. When it wouldn't budge, they moved to the hinge side of the door and tried there. It's not moving, Casey said, mopping the forehead from his arm with his arm. Keep trying, Margaret said. Here, let's both push it. Digging the claw in just above the lower hinge, they both pushed the handle of the hammer with all their strength. It moved a little, Margaret said, breathing hard. They kept at it. The wet wood began to crack. They both pushed against the hammer, wedging the claw into the crack. Finally, with a loud ripping sound, they managed to pull the door off. Huh? Casey dropped the hammer. They both squinted into the dark closet and screamed in horror when they saw what was inside. That was the end of chapter 17, starting chapter 18. Look, Margaret cried, her heart thudding. She suddenly felt dizzy. She gripped the side of the closet to steady herself. I don't believe this, Casey said quietly, his voice trembling as he stared into the long, narrow supply closet. They both gaped at the weird plants that filled the closet. Were they plants? Under the dim ceiling bulb, they bent and writhed and groaning, breathing, sighing. Branches shook, leaves shimmered and moved. Tall plants leaned forward as if reaching out to Margaret and Casey. Look at that one, Casey cried, taking a step back, stumbling into Margaret. It has an arm. Oh, Margaret followed Casey's stare. Casey was right. The tall, leafy plant appeared to have a green, human arm descending from its stalk. Margaret's eyes darted around the closet. To her horror, she realized that several plants seemed to have human features. Green arms, a yellow hand with 3 fingers poking from it, 2 stumpy legs where the stem should be. She and her brother both cried out when they saw the plant with the face. Inside a cluster of broad leaves, there appeared to grow a round green tomato, but the tomato had a human-shaped nose and an open mouth, from which it repeatedly uttered the most mournful sighs and groans. Another plant, a short plant with clusters of broad, oval leaves, had 2 green, nearly human faces partly hidden by the leaves, both wailing through open mouths. Let's get out of here, Casey cried, grabbing Margaret's hand in fear and tugging her away from the closet. This is gross, the plants moaned inside. Green, fingerless hands reached out to Margaret and Casey. A yellow, sick-looking plant near the wall made choking sounds. A tall flowering plant staggered toward them, thin, tendril-like arms outstretched. Wait, Margaret cried, pulling her hand out of Casey's. She spotted something on the closet floor, behind the moaning, shifting plants. Casey, what's that? She asked, pointing. She struggled to focus her eyes in the dim light of the closet. On the floor behind the plants, near the shelves on the back wall, were 2 human feet. Margaret stepped cautiously into the closet. The feet she saw were attached to legs. Margaret, let's go, Casey pleaded. No, look, there's someone back there, Margaret said, staring hard. Huh? A person, not a plant, Margaret cried. She took another step. A soft green arm brushed against her side. Margaret, what are you doing? Casey asked, his voice high and frightened. I have to see who it is, Margaret said. She took a deep breath and held it. Then, ignoring the moans, the sighs, the green arms reaching out to her, the hideous green tomato faces, she plunged through the plants to the back of the closet. Dad! She cried. Her father was lying on the floor, his hands and feet tied tightly with plant tendrils, his mouth gagged by a wide strip of plastic tape. Margaret! Casey was beside her. He lowered his eyes to the floor. Oh no! Their father stared up at them, pleading with his eyes. Mmm, he cried, struggling to talk through the gag. Margaret dived to the floor and started to untie him. No, stop, Casey cried, and pulled her back by the shoulders. Casey, let go of me. What's wrong with you? Margaret cried angrily. It's Dad. It can't be Dad, Casey said, still holding her by the shoulders. Dad is at the airport, remember? Behind them, the plants seemed to be moaning in unison, a terrifying chorus. A tall plant fell over and rolled toward the open closet door. Their father continued to plead, struggling at the tendrils that imprisoned him. I've got to get to untie him, Margaret told her brother. Let go of me. No, Casey insisted. Margaret, look at his head. Margaret turned her eyes to her father's head. He was bareheaded, no Dodgers cap. He had tufts of green leaves growing where his hair should be. We've already seen that, Margaret snapped. It's a side effect, remember? She reached down to pull at his father's ropes. No, don't, Casey insisted. Okay, Margaret said. I'll just pull the tape off his mouth. I won't untie him. She reached down and tugged at the elastic tape until she managed to get it off. Kids, I'm so glad to see you, Dr. Brewer said. Quick, untie me. How did you get in here? Casey demanded, standing above him, hands on his hips, staring down at him suspiciously. We saw you leave for the airport. That wasn't me, Dr. Brewer said. I've been locked in here for days. Huh? Casey cried. But we saw you, Margaret started. It wasn't me. It's a plant, Dr. Brewer said. It's a plant copy of me. Dad, Casey said. Please, there's no time to explain, their father said urgently, raising his leaf-covered head to look toward the closet doorway. Just untie me, quick. The father we've been living with. We've been living with? He's a plant? Margaret cried, swallowing hard. Yes, please untie me. Margaret reached for the tendrils. No, Casey insisted. How do we know you're telling the truth? I'll explain everything, I promise, he pleaded. Hurry, our lives are at stake. Mr. Martinez is here too. Startled, Margaret turned her eyes to the far wall. Sure enough, Mr. Martinez also lay on the floor, bound and gagged. Let me out, please, her father cried. Behind them, plants moaned and cried. Margaret couldn't stand it anymore. I'm untying him, she told Casey, and bent down to start grappling with the tendrils. Her father sighed gratefully. Casey bent down and reluctantly began working at the tendrils too. Finally, they had loosened them enough so their father could slip out. He climbed to his feet slowly, stretching his arms, moving his legs, bending his knees. Man, that feels good, he said, giving Margaret and Casey a grim smile. Dad, should we untie Mr. Martinez? Margaret asked. But without warning, Dr. Brewer pushed past the two kids and made his way out of the closet. Dad, whoa, where are you going? Margaret called. You said you explained everything, Casey insisted. He and his sister ran through the moaning plants, following their father. I will, breathing hard. Dr. Brewer strode quickly to the woodpile against the far wall. Margaret and Casey both gasped as he picked up an axe. He spun around to face them, holding the thick axe handle with both hands. His face frozen with determination. He started toward them. Dad, what are you doing? Margaret cried. That's the end of chapter 18. We now go to chapter 19. Swinging the axe onto his shoulder, Dr. Brewer advanced on Margaret and Casey. He groaned from the effort of raising the heavy tool, his face reddening, his eyes wide, excited. Dad, please, Margaret cried, gripping Casey's shoulder, backing up toward the jungle of plants in the center of the room. What are you doing? She repeated. He's not our real father, Casey cried. I told you we shouldn't untie him. He is our real father, Margaret insisted. I know he is. She, she turned her eyes to her father, looking for an answer, but he stared back at them, his face filled with confusion and menace, the axe in his hands gleaming under the bright ceiling lights. Dad, answer us, Margaret demanded. Answer us. Before Dr. Brewer could reply, they heard loud, rapid footsteps clumping down the basement steps. All four of them turned to the doorway of the plant room to see an alarmed-looking Dr. Brewer enter. He grabbed the bill of his Dodgers cap as he strode angrily toward the two kids. What are you two doing down here? He cried. You promised me. Here's your mother. Don't you want to? Mrs. Brewer appeared at his side. She started to call out a greeting, but stopped, freezing in horror when she saw the confusing scene. No! She screamed, seeing the other Dr. Brewer, the capless Dr. Brewer holding an axe in front of him with both hands. No! Her face filled with horror. She turned to the Dr. Brewer that had just brought her home. He glared accusingly at Margaret and Casey. What have you done? You let him escape. He's our dad, Margaret said, in a tiny little voice she barely recognized. I'm your dad, said the Dr. Brewer at the doorway bellowed. Not him. He's not your dad. He's not even human. He's a plant. Margaret and Casey both gasped and drew back in terror. You're the plant, the bareheaded Dr. Brewer accused, raising the axe. He's dangerous, the Dr. Brewer exclaimed. The other Dr. Brewer explained. How could you have let him out? Caught in the middle, Margaret and Casey stared from one father to the other. Who was their real father? End of chapter 19, beginning of chapter 20. That's not your father, Dr. Brewer said. The Dodgers cap cried again, moving into the room. He's a copy, a plant copy, one of my experiments that went wrong. I locked him in the supply closet because he's dangerous. You're the copy, the other Dr. Brewer accused, and raised the axe again. Margaret and Casey stood motionless, exchanging terrified glances. Kids, what have you done? Mrs. Brewer cried, her hands pressed against her cheeks, her eyes wide with disbelief. What have we done? Margaret asked her brother in a low voice, staring wide-eyed from one man to the other. Casey seemed too frightened to reply. I don't know what to do, Casey managed to whisper. What can we do? Margaret wondered silently, realizing that her entire body was trembling. He has to be destroyed, the axe-wielding Dr. Brewer shouted, staring at his look-alike across the room. Beside them, plants quivered and shook, sighing loudly. Tendrils slithered across the dirt. Leaves shimmered and whispered. Put down the axe. You're not fooling anyone, the other Dr. Brewer said. You have to be destroyed, Dr. Brewer with no cap repeated, his eyes wild, his face scarlet, moving closer, the axe gleaming as if electrified under the white light. Dad would never act like this, Margaret realized. Casey and I were idiots. We let him out of the closet, and now he's going to kill our real dad and mom. And then us. What can I do, she wondered, trying to think clearly even though her mind was whirring wildly out of control. What can I do? Uttering a desperate cry of protest, Margaret leapt forward and grabbed the axe from the imposter's hands. He gasped in surprise as she steadied her grip on the handle. It was heavier than she'd imagined. Get back, she screamed. Get back, now. Margaret, wait, her mother cried, still too frightened to move from the doorway. The capless Dr. Brewer reached for the axe. Give it back to me. You don't know what you're doing, he pleaded, and made a wild grab for it. Margaret pulled back and swung the axe. Stay back, everyone, stay back. Thank goodness, Dr. Brewer with the Dodgers cap exclaimed. We've got to get him back in the closet. He's very dangerous. He stepped up to Margaret. Give me the axe. Margaret hesitated. Give me the axe, he insisted. Margaret turned to her mother. What should I do? Mrs. Brewer shrugged hopelessly. I don't know. Princess, don't do it, the capitalist Dr. Brewer said softly, staring into Margaret's eyes. He called me princess, Margaret realized. The other one never had. Does this mean that the dad in the closet is my real dad? Margaret, give me the axe. The one in the cap made a grab for it. Margaret backed away and swung the axe again. Get back, both of you. Stay back, she warned. I'm warning you, Dr. Brewer in the cap said. He's dangerous. Listen to me, Margaret. Get back, she repeated, desperately trying to decide what to do. Which one is my real dad? Which one? Which one? Which one? Her eyes darting back and forth from one to the other. She saw that each of them had a bandage around his right hand, and it gave her an idea. Casey, there's a knife on the wall over there, she said, still holding the axe poised. Get it for me, fast. Casey obediently hurried to the wall. It took him a short while to find the knife among all the tools hanging there. He reached up on tiptoes to pull it down, then hurried back to Margaret with it. Margaret lowered the axe and took the long-bladed knife with him. Margaret, give me the axe, the man in the Dodger's cap insisted impatiently. Margaret, what are you doing? The man from the supply closet asked, suddenly looking frightened. I have an idea, Margaret said hesitantly. She took a deep breath. Then she stepped over to the man from the supply closet and pushed the knife blade into his arm. End of chapter 20, beginning chapter 21. Ow, he cried out as the blade cut through the skin. Margaret pulled the knife back, having made a tiny puncture hole. Red blood trickled from the hole. He's our real dad, she told Casey, sighing with relief. Here, Dad. She handed him the axe. Margaret, you're wrong. The man in the baseball cap cried in alarm. He's tricked you. He's tricked you. The capitalist Dr. Brewer moved quickly. He picked up the axe, took 3 steps forward, pulled the axe back, and swung with all his might. The Dr. Brewer in the cap opened his mouth wide and uttered a hushed cry of alarm. The cry was choked off as the axe cut easily through his body, slicing him in two. A thick green liquid oozed from the wound, and as the man fell, his mouth locked open in disbelief and horror. Margaret could see that his body was actually a stem. He had no bones, no human organs. The body thudded to the floor. Green liquid puddled around it. Princess, we're okay, Dr. Brewer cried, flinging the axe aside. You guessed right. It wasn't a guess, Margaret said, sinking into his arms. I remembered the green blood. I saw it, late at night. One of you was in the bathroom bleeding green blood. I knew my real dad would have red blood. We're okay, Mrs. Brewer cried, rushing into her husband's arms. We're okay. We're all okay. All 4 of them rushed together in an emotional family hug. One more thing we have to do, their father said, his arms around the 2 kids. Let's get Mr. Martinez out of the closet. By dinner time, things had almost returned to normal. They had finally managed to welcome their mother home and tried to explain to her all that had happened in her absence. Mrs. Martinez had been rescued from the supply closet, not too much the worse for wear. He and Dr. Brewer had a long discussion about what happened and about Dr. Brewer's work. He expressed total bewilderment as to what Dr. Brewer had accomplished, but he knew enough to realize that it was historic. Perhaps you need the structured environment the lab on campus offers. I'll talk to the board members about getting you back on staff, Martinez said. It was his way of inviting their father back to work. After Mr. Martinez was driven home, Dr. Brewer disappeared into the basement for about an hour. He returned grim-faced and exhausted. I destroyed most of the plants, he explained, sinking into an armchair. I had to. They were suffering. Later, I'll destroy the rest. Every single plant? Mrs. Brewer asked. Well, there are a few normal ones that I can plant out back in the garden, he replied. He shook his head sadly. Only a few. At dinner, he finally had the strength to explain to Margaret, Casey, and Mrs. Brewer what had happened down in the basement. I was working on a super plant, he said, trying to electronically make a new plant using DNA elements from other plants. Then I accidentally cut my hand on a slide. I didn't realize it, but some of my blood got mixed in with the plant molecules I was using. When I turned on the machine, my molecules got mixed in with the plant molecules, and I ended up with something that was part human, part plant. That's gross, Casey exclaimed, dropping a fork full of mashed potatoes. Well, I'm a scientist, Dr. Brewer replied, so I didn't think it was gross. I thought it was pretty exciting. I mean, here I was, inventing an entirely new kind of creature. Those plants with faces, Margaret started. Her father nodded. Yes, those were things I made by inserting human materials into plant materials. I kept putting them in the supply closet. I got carried away. I didn't know how far I could go, how human I could make the plants. I could see that my creations were unhappy, suffering, but I couldn't stop. It was too exciting. He took a long drink of water from his glass. You didn't tell me any of this, Mrs. Brewer said, shaking her head. I couldn't, he said. I couldn't tell anyone. I was too involved. Then one day, I went too far. I created a plant that was an exact copy of me in almost every way. He looked like me, he sounded like me, and he had my brain and my mind. But he still acted like a plant in some ways, Margaret said. He ate plant food and he wasn't perfect, Dr. Brewer said, leaning forward over the dinner table, talking in a low, serious voice. He had flaws, but he was strong enough and smart enough to overpower me. To lock me in the closet, to take my place, and to continue my experiments. And when Martinez arrived unexpectedly, he locked Martinez in the closet too, so that his secret would be safe. Was the head full of leaves one of the flaws? Casey asked. Dr. Brewer nodded. Yes, he was almost a perfect clone of me, almost a perfect human, but not quite. But Dad, Margaret said, pointing, you have leaves on your head too. He reached up and pulled one off. I know, he said, making a disgusted face. That's really gross, huh? Everyone agreed. Well, when I cut my hand, some of the plant materials mixed with my blood got into my system, he explained. And then I turned on the machine. The machine created a strong chemical reaction between the plant materials and my blood. Then my hair fell out overnight, and the leaves immediately started to sprout. Don't worry, guys. The leaves are falling out already. I think my hair will grow back. Margaret and Casey cheered. I guess things will return to normal around here, Mrs. Brewer said, smiling at her husband. Better than normal, he said, smiling back. If Martinez convinces the board to give me my job back, I'll clear out the basement and turn it into the best game room you ever saw. Margaret and Casey cheered again. We're all alive and safe, Dr. Brewer said, hugging both kids at once. Thanks to you two. It was the happiest dinner Margaret could remember. They had cleaned up. They all went out for ice cream. It was nearly 10 o'clock when they returned. Dr. Brewer headed for the basement. Hey, where are you going? His wife called suspiciously. I'm just going down to deal with the rest of the plants, Dr. Brewer assured her. I want to make sure that everything is gone, that this horrible chapter in our lives is over. By the end of the week, most of the plants had been destroyed. A giant pile of leaves, roots, and stalks were burned in a bonfire that lasted for hours. A few tiny plants had been transplanted outside. All the equipment had been dismantled and trucked into the university. On Saturday, all four brewers went to select a pool table for the new basement rec room. On Sunday, Margaret found herself standing in back by the garden, staring up at the golden hills. It's so peaceful now, she thought happily. So peaceful here, and so beautiful. The smile faded from her face when she heard the whisper at her feet. Margaret! She looked down to see a small yellow flower nudging her ankle. Margaret, the flower whispered. Help me. Please, help me. I'm your father. Really. I'm your real father. And that's the end of the Goosebumps of Stay Out of the Basement. Interesting that it ended on a cliffhanger. Gives you questions as to what happens after she realized that this plant at the end of the book calls out, I'm your real father. But I have a suspicious feeling that was not her real father. I have just that feeling that's not a real father. It's probably like part of the DNA of what her dad was explaining, her real dad was explaining. But it also could be that her dad actually lied. This was another copy of her dad, and he just simply lied that all the plants were destroyed, and this might be just him trying to experiment more. We may not know. I'm not fully sure about what goes on in the world of Goosebumps, but it does have an interesting cliffhanger. And the fact that these books, you can read them out of any order whatsoever, makes it even more interesting. So the artwork is very beautiful, by the way. Definitely shows its age and age on the book. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this Halloween special of Goosebumps. If I'm able to get to more of the Halloween specials with the Goosebumps series, I will be more than happy. If you have another suggestion of another book that I could read, please comment down below. If you're enjoying this series of Goosebumps, please comment down below and like and subscribe to my channel. Until my next video, I will be doing a comparison on the book and the two-part episode of this. So until next time, I'm the Loyal Hufflepuff, and I'll see you all in the next video.